seen as a burden by her own daughter and thrown out like old trash. At 91 years old, her only home was a cold, filthy garbage dump. Every night, she closed her eyes, not praying to live, but praying simply not to die alone. But she didn't know that destiny had one final test in store for her. One night, amidst the scrap, she found a man tied up and dying. By deciding to save that life, she had no idea she was planting the seed for the greatest miracle of her life. This story of betrayal, compassion, and unbelievable redemption will make you reflect. It's wonderful to have you here. Where are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Let's begin this journey together. In a modest house in a poor neighborhood of Louisville, Kentucky, the sound of rain fell hard on the tin roof, marking a sad, constant rhythm that seemed to accompany the accumulated exhaustion of the years. Stephanie paced back and forth in the dining room, arms crossed, brow furrowed, a mix of annoyance and frustration in her eyes. She had spent the entire morning arguing with her husband, Gregory, about the same old thing. Her mother, the elderly Ruth, who occupied a small room at the back of the house. Gregory, sitting with a cigarette between his fingers, watched his wife with a cold smile, telling her it was time to stop carrying a responsibility that wasn't theirs. He explained that having a sick old woman under their roof only brought expenses, conflicts, and bad smells, that they couldn't keep living as if they were a nursing home. Stephanie responded that it was her mother, that the thought of leaving her alone pained her, but her voice trembled when Gregory interrupted, saying she was no saint and that her mother had lived long enough, that the world doesn't stop for one old woman. The conversation grew more tense when he insisted that the old woman's presence scared off visitors and that the neighbors were starting to murmur that they were living with a burden. Stephanie, exhausted from years of caregiving, sleepless nights, and the weight of an unappreciated life, felt her resolve crumble. Gregory's words were like acid, dissolving the last of her devotion. He wasn't just complaining about the smell, he was painting a picture of her future, a lonely, wasted life, tied to a thankless duty while the world passed her by. He made her feel foolish for her loyalty, weak for her compassion. The exhaustion, mixed with a bitter seed of resentment and shame, finally made her break. Her tone changed when she said she couldn't go on like this, arguing that she deserved to live her own life before she grew old next to a woman who barely remembered her name. She was no longer just tired. She was defeated by her own weakness. In the back room, 1-year-old Ruth heard every word through the half-open door. She felt her heart shrink with each sentence, as if a piece of her soul were slowly detaching. She didn't cry. She just clutched her rosary and whispered for God to give her the strength not to hate her own daughter. She remembered the years she raised her alone, the days she washed other people's clothes to buy her shoes, the winters she slept without a blanket so the girl wouldn't be cold. All of that now seemed like a distant echo, erased by the comfort and ambition Gregory had sown in Stephanie's heart. As evening fell, the sky turned darker, and thunder rattled the windows. Gregory, impatient, grabbed a small old suitcase and placed it on Ruth's bed. He told her dryly that it was time to go, that they couldn't keep her anymore. Stephanie, standing by the door, avoided looking at her directly. She said she was doing it for everyone's good, that she needed peace, and that her mother would be better off somewhere else, where someone could take care of her. But no such place existed. Ruth understood the lie, though she didn't confront it. She walked slowly to the bed, packed her rosary in the suitcase, a clean blouse, an old photo of her daughter as a child, and a small image of the Virgin Mary she had owned since she was young. Then she approached Stephanie and told her with a soft voice that she forgave her, that she understood her decision. Because true love doesn't demand to stay, it only wishes for the other to find peace. Stephanie didn't answer. She just lowered her gaze as her mother walked toward the door with slow steps, each one marked by the weight of a life dedicated to sacrifice. Outside, the rain was heavier. Ruth covered her head with her shawl and left without looking back. Behind her, the door closed with a sharp thud that resonated like an ending. The water soaked her face. But she didn't stop. She walked through the muddy dirt roads, watching the distant city lights, which seemed to laugh at her misfortune. She clutched the suitcase to her chest, and in her mind, she repeated a prayer, asking the Virgin not to let her lose her faith. She passed a group of children playing in the rain. One of them looked at her curiously. Another mocked her, calling her crazy. She smiled tenderly and kept walking. As she moved toward the outskirts, the houses became scarcer and the pavement disappeared. The smell of wet earth mixed with that of waste, a sign that she was near the dump. Her feet, swollen and tired, sank into the mud, but she didn't complain. She looked up at the cloud-covered sky and said that if her daughter had forgotten her, at least God would remember her. She reached a large plot of land where piles of trash formed irregular hills. There were dogs searching for scraps of food, shadows moving among the waste, and a silence broken only by the sound of the wind. That first night was a new kind of hell. The rain had stopped, but the cold was a physical thing, a damp, heavy blanket that seeped into her 9 one-year-old bones. She huddled behind a mound of rotting refuse, clutching her suitcase, her stomach knotted with a hunger so sharp it felt like a betrayal. For a fleeting, terrible moment, her faith wavered. She felt utterly alone, forgotten not just by her daughter, but by God himself. She was just a piece of trash, waiting to be buried with the rest. The tears that came were not of sadness, but of abject despair, a cold, empty void she had never known. This is the lowest point a soul can reach, feeling forgotten not just by family, but by God himself. But destiny wasn't finished with Ruth. This was only the beginning of her true test. She decided to stop there. She placed her suitcase on a piece of dry cardboard and sat down. She felt the cold seep into her bones, but instead of crying, she gave thanks for still being alive. Among the debris, a faint light caught her attention. It was a piece of glass reflecting a broken image of the Virgin Mary. She picked it up carefully and cleaned it with her skirt. She placed it in front of her on a rock and said that if this was her new home, then the Virgin would live there with her too. She wrapped herself in her shawl, closed her eyes, and began to pray. She said she held no grudge, that forgiveness was the only path that kept the soul clean. In the distance, lightning lit up the sky, and for a moment, the reflection from the image seemed to shine as if responding to her. Ruth smiled. In her solitude, she found a strange peace as night fell over the city, and the sounds of the dump mixed with the rain. The old woman fell asleep for the first time without a roof over her head, but with a heart free of hatred. She didn't know that this place, this corner, forgotten by all, would become the stage for the greatest test of her faith, and perhaps her final redemption. During the first weeks at the dump, Ruth's world shrank to a mixture of harsh smells, muffled sounds, and a silence that hurt more than hunger. Each dawn was a raw test of endurance. There was no immediate divine strength, only the grim, animalistic need to survive. She would get up before the sun touched the hills of garbage, her body aching, wrapped in her gray shawl, her old suitcase by her side. Her first days were not spent in prayer, but in a humiliating search for something, anything, edible. She walked slowly among the piles of waste, searching for pieces of bread, wilted fruit, or leftover food that the trucks had dumped the night before. A skinny dog with sad eyes began to follow her from the first day. His fur was matted, and one paw was injured, but his eyes conveyed the same loneliness as the old woman's. Ruth spoke to him as if he were a son, telling him that God doesn't forget the small or the poor, that even in the trash, one can find miracles. When she found something to eat, she divided every piece in two, one for herself and one for the animal. She called him Buddy because she said he kept her company like a grandchild sent from heaven. In the late afternoon, she would find a corner where the wind didn't blow so hard and organized her small shelter with pieces of cardboard and plastic. The ground was damp and smelled of decay, but she covered it with her shawl and said that as long as the soul was clean, the dirt on the body didn't matter. Her voice was low but firm when she said that poverty was not a punishment, but a path to humility. The days passed, and the old woman began to meet others, who, like her, lived among the world's refuse. They were men and women with weathered faces, lost gazes, and tired hearts. Some collected cans. Others slept under makeshift tarps. They all carried a story of abandonment, of mistakes, or of fate. At first, they looked at her with suspicion, wondering what such an old woman was doing in a place like this. She would reply that life had brought her here, and that as long as she breathed, she would continue to give thanks. A man named Martin, who had been a construction worker, approached her one day to offer her a piece of bread. He told her this was no place for a grandmother, that the city was cruel, and that no one lasted long here. Ruth smiled and replied that she wasn't afraid to die because fear belongs to those who haven't yet learned to trust in God. That sentence, spoken with such calm, hung in the air and touched those who heard it. From then on, some began to seek her out at dusk. They would sit beside her and listen to her speak of faith, of forgiveness, of the importance of remembering that even the discarded have a soul worthy of love. Ruth didn't preach with authority, but with tenderness. She taught them simple prayers, spoke to them of the value of each dawn, and encouraged them to ask not for riches, but for peace in their hearts. Every word she spoke had the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice, and that's why they all listened in silence, as if each syllable were a small comfort. As the weeks passed, Ruth gathered some objects she found in the trash and turned them into her altar. A wooden plank served as a table. A broken bottle held a makeshift candle made from melted wax and an old string. And on top of it all, she placed the broken image of the Virgin Mary she had rescued on her first night. Every evening, when the sky turned red and the smoke from the dump covered the horizon, she would light that candle and kneel on the ground. She would say in a low voice that she wasn't asking for food or shelter, but for the strength not to let hatred enter her soul. Sometimes the others would join her, forming a small circle of shadows around the flickering light. One of the men, named Dennis, asked her one night why she kept giving thanks if life had stripped her of everything. Ruth replied that when you lose everything, you learn what truly matters. She said she still had her hands, her voice, and her faith, and that as long as she could pray, she would still have company. Dennis bowed his head, and for the first time in a long time, wept without shame. That night, the old woman unknowingly became the heart of the dump. There were no sermons, no visible miracles, but there was a calm that spread to those who came near. They began to call her respectfully Miss Ruth, and some even said she had the gift of calming the storms of the soul. Rumors began to spread among the nearby neighborhoods. People spoke of an old saint who lived in the trash and prayed for everyone. Some called her the crazy lady of the dump. Others said she was a spirit, but those who knew her knew she was simply a woman who refused to give up. One day, a woman from a neighboring community came by to leave her a bag of bread and a blanket. She told her she had heard about her and that her faith had moved her. Ruth thanked her and said she was no saint, just another mother, and that if her story helped someone remember their own, then it was worth staying alive. Buddy, the dog, lay down beside her, wagging his tail, and Ruth stroked his head, saying that even animals knew how to recognize love. One night, when everyone was asleep, the wind blew hard and extinguished the candle, but she didn't get up to relight it. She looked toward the image of the Virgin and said that even if the light went out, faith continued to burn in the heart. In the silence, she felt she wasn't alone. She remembered the words she used to repeat to Stephanie when she was a child, telling her that goodness isn't measured by what one has, but by what one is capable of giving when there's nothing left. She smiled at the thought, and although a tear slid down her cheek, it wasn't of sadness, but of gratitude. Life in the trash had taken everything material from her, but it had given her back something she thought she'd lost: the certainty that the soul, when kept clean, can illuminate even the darkest of places. And so, while the city slept, unaware that on its margins breathed an example of love and resilience, Miss Ruth continued to pray, surrounded by cardboard, silence, and stars that shone like witnesses to her intact dignity. Night had fallen over the dump like a heavy blanket of silence and shadow. The air was damp, dense, heavy with the smell of waste and the smoke from the piles burning slowly in the distance. Miss Ruth was huddled in her usual corner, covered with her shawl and accompanied by Buddy the dog, who slept curled at her feet. The day had been long, her bones ached, and her body begged for rest, but her mind found no peace. She prayed in a low voice, as she did every night, asking the Virgin Mary to watch over those who suffered more than she. She had learned to be thankful even for the cold, because she said that as long as the body felt pain, it was a sign it was still alive. Outside, the wind whistled through the mounds of trash and rattled the rusty metal sheets that served as roofs for some of the homeless. Ruth closed her eyes, but suddenly she heard a sound that wasn't the wind. It was a distant moan, almost imperceptible, like the cry of a child or the whimper of a wounded animal. She opened her eyes and sat up with difficulty, leaning on her cane. The dog raised his ears and began to growl, but she stroked his back, telling him to be calm, that perhaps it was someone who needed help. The moan came again, clearer this time, accompanied by a choked murmur. The old woman felt a shiver, but not of fear of premonition. She said that voice wasn't the wind. Someone was suffering. At 91, in the dark, most would hide. But Ruth's compassion was always stronger than her fear. This single decision to follow the sound is about to change her destiny forever. She grabbed an old flashlight she had found days earlier, which barely lit up, and began to walk among the mounds of trash, guided more by faith than by sight. The mud came up to her ankles, and her cane sank with every step, but she kept going. As she got closer, the moans became more desperate, and she could hear the sound of ragged breathing. Ruth raised the flashlight and saw something that chilled her blood. A human figure lying on the ground, motionless, tied with thick ropes, his face covered with a dirty blindfold. For a moment, she thought it was a corpse, but then she heard a weak sigh. She knelt beside him, her heart pounding. She said not to be afraid, that she was there to help. The man tried to speak, but his voice came out as a broken whisper. He mumbled something she didn't understand. He only managed to say not to let him die. Ruth looked at the ropes and saw they were tightened to the point of breaking the skin. She searched through the waste and found an old broken can, from which she tore a sharp piece of metal. With her trembling hands, she began to cut the ropes one by one, praying in a low voice, asking God to give her strength. She said it wasn't her strength that would save him, but the Virgin's. Each cut was an enormous effort, and the darkness seemed to close in on them. When she finally managed to free the man, he fell into her lap, unconscious. Ruth looked at him and saw his face was beaten, his lips split, and his hands marked by the ropes. His chest rose and fell with difficulty. She said she had to move him before he died of the cold. She looked around for help, but there was no one. The dump was deserted. So she bent down, grabbed the man under the arms, and began to drag him slowly toward her shelter. The effort made her bones ache, but she didn't stop. She said each step was an act of faith, that if she had come this far, it was because God willed it. Buddy walked beside them, sniffing the air as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The journey was long. It seemed endless. The ground was slippery, and the flashlight went out several times. Ruth stumbled, fell to her knees, but got up again. She said she couldn't leave him there, that no one should die alone. When she finally reached her shelter, the man was barely breathing. She laid him down on her bed of cardboard, covering him with her shawl. She ran to get a little water from a can she kept for herself and carefully poured it over his lips. She told him to hold on, that life doesn't end until God decides. He opened his eyes for just an instant, and in them, there was a glimmer of fear and gratitude. He tried to speak but only managed to say that he thought he was dead. Ruth replied that as long as the heart beats, there is always hope. She spent the rest of the night by his side, cleaning his wounds with old rags and murmuring prayers. At one point, the man lost consciousness again, and the exhausted old woman watched his face. She thought that perhaps heaven had sent her this test to remind her that her life still had purpose. She said in a low voice that perhaps this man was her path to redemption, a way to return all the love she once didn't know how to receive. Outside, the rain had stopped and the silence returned. But inside the small shelter, the ragged breathing of the injured man mixed with the whisper of the old woman's prayers. When the sunrise began to paint the horizon, Ruth was still awake, watching over his sleep like a mother protecting a child. Her gaze was tired, but full of peace. She said that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same, because when one decides to help a neighbor, even in misery, something changes forever in the soul. As the sun began to warm the dump, the dog barked softly, as if announcing that life was returning. Ruth took the man's hand and told him to rest, that he was safe now, that God had brought him to her for a reason they would both discover in time. At that moment, a slight breeze moved the image of the Virgin hanging on the cardboard wall, and the dawn light reflected on her weary face. The old woman smiled and said that the paths of heaven were mysterious, but always perfect. She had saved a life, and in doing so, had bound her fate to his. And in the midst of the trash and poverty, a story of compassion had been born that would change two destinies forever. The dawn arrived, covering the dump with a cold, gray light that barely managed to pierce the smoke from the mounds of waste. Miss Ruth was kneeling beside the body of the man she had rescued the night before, her hands trembling and her eyes swollen from the vigil. She had spent the entire night caring for him, cleaning his wounds with rags she washed in murky water, and asking God over and over not to let him die there, amid the trash and oblivion. She said that if heaven had placed this soul in front of her, it must mean she still had a mission to fulfill on earth. The man was breathing with difficulty. His chest rose and fell in a weak rhythm, and every so often, a moan escaped his split lips. Ruth leaned over him, tenderly wiping the sweat from his brow, and told him in a low voice not to give up, that life was stronger than pain. Buddy the dog watched in silence from a corner, wagging his tail whenever the old woman spoke, as if he understood that something sacred was happening. The smell of the dump was unbearable, a mixture of decomposition and smoke, but Ruth didn't notice it. Her mind was fixed on that man who had come into her life like a shadow, and who now depended completely on her care. Hours passed, and the sun began to warm the air. Exhausted, Ruth sat down beside him and looked at the sky. She said that if the Lord had allowed her to find him, then he must give her the strength to keep him alive. Just then, the man moved slightly, letting out a deep sigh. Ruth leaned in quickly, took his hand, and felt a faint squeeze. She said he was awake, that God had heard her. His eyes opened slowly, cloudy, disoriented, trying to recognize where he was. He saw the face of that old woman with wrinkled skin and a serene gaze, and for an instant he thought he was dead, that it was an angel looking at him. He stammered that if he was still alive, it was because of her, but Ruth shook her head and told him not to thank her, but to thank heaven, because she had only done what her heart commanded. He asked with a weak voice who she was and where he was. She replied that her name was Ruth, and that they were in a place where forgotten people found refuge. She told him she had found him tied up, that she thought he wasn't breathing, but something in her soul told her she had to help him. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his ribs made him fall back. Ruth asked him not to move, that he was still weak, and covered him better with a dirty blanket she had found among the waste. She said the body heals with rest and faith, and that he must trust her. For the following days, the old woman dedicated herself completely to his care. He drifted in and out of consciousness, a feverish haze. But through the pain, he was aware of her. He was aware of the small, trembling hands forcing sips of water past his broken lips. He was aware of the smell of the damp rags she used to clean his wounds, rags she had to wash in filthy water. He was aware of her voice, a constant, low murmur of prayer, asking God to spare him. He had been left to die by criminals, but he was being saved by a woman who had even less than nothing. Every night, she lit her candle in front of the Virgin and prayed for his recovery, and he watched her through half-closed eyes, thinking she was an angel. She said this man was proof that God never abandons his own, but he knew she was the proof. Over time, he regained his strength. On a warm, sunny morning, when the birdsong could barely be heard over the murmur of the dump, the man opened his eyes and was able to sit up. He looked around, confused by the place, by the smell, by the contrast between the misery of the surroundings and the peace he felt. Ruth was grinding a piece of stale bread against a stone to soften it with a little hot water she had heated over a can. She told him to eat slowly, that even if the bread was old, it was blessed by faith. He took the piece with trembling hands, looking at her in disbelief. He said that no one in his life had ever offered him anything with such kindness, that it was a strange kind of miracle to receive food in a dump from a woman who had less than he did. Ruth smiled and replied that miracles aren't found in temples, but in hearts that still know how to share. He began to eat, and felt it was the sweetest taste in the world because it was mixed with gratitude. Tears welled up in his eyes, and Ruth, seeing him cry, asked him why he was doing so. He replied that he didn't understand how an old woman who had found him in the trash could treat him with such love. He said that if the world had a little of her heart, no one would die of loneliness. She moved closer, took his hand, and told him that life had taught her that when one gives, one always receives, even if not immediately. She said she had no riches, but that faith made her feel richer than many. He nodded, moved, and asked her age. She replied that she was past 90 and that every day was one more gift she didn't expect, but that as long as she had the strength to help someone, she didn't mind old age. He said his name was Walter, that he was a businessman, that he had been kidnapped for money, and that his captors had left him there, believing him dead. His voice trembled as he remembered the fear and the darkness, but Ruth interrupted him, saying he shouldn't think about the past, that the important thing was that he had survived, and that he should thank God for the second chance. She said that life always finds a way, even in the trash, just like flowers that grow in the most unexpected corners. Walter looked at her in silence, as if every word from this old woman was a lesson written directly by heaven. That same night, as the wind blew softly, he told her he didn't know how to thank her. Ruth replied that there was nothing to thank her for, that when one helps a neighbor, it is God who takes care of the reward. But he insisted, saying he would not forget what she had done, that his heart could not erase the image of this old woman praying beside him as life returned to his body. He said that from that day on, he would consider her his spiritual mother, the mother that life gave him when all seemed lost. She had lost a daughter to ambition, but here, in the depths of misery, she gained a son through compassion. This is the miracle. This is the moment the story truly changes. Ruth smiled, and a tear shone on her cheek. She said that if life was giving her a new son, then her loneliness had not been in vain. They stared at the small fire she had lit with pieces of cardboard, and the silence surrounding them was different. It was no longer empty, but filled with something new, invisible, and sacred. Walter said that if he got out of that place, he would never leave her alone. Ruth replied that she wasn't afraid of being alone because she knew that true love leaves roots in the soul, no matter the distance. That night, the dump ceased to be a place of waste and was transformed into a sanctuary of humanity. The wind brought a different, cleaner smell, as if heaven wanted to bless the new bond that had been born between a forgotten old woman and a reborn man. And as the stars appeared one by one on the horizon, Ruth thought that the miracle she had prayed for so long wasn't for someone to save her, but for her to be able to save someone else, to feel alive again. The days began to pass slowly at the dump, but they were no longer the same. Walter's presence had changed the air of the place, as if a small current of hope had begun to move through the debris. The man, though still weak, had regained color in his face and firmness in his eyes. Every morning, as the sun barely peeked over the mountains of trash, he would get up with effort and say that he needed to repay everything this old woman had done for him. Ruth would look at him tenderly and tell him not to push himself too hard, that his body was still healing, but he would reply that staying still made him feel useless and that he had to give back a little of the good he had received. That's how he began to help her. At first, he barely walked a few yards, collecting cardboard or bottles that he then sold to the local recyclers. With that money, they bought some bread, a little rice, and occasionally some medicine they got cheaply at a nearby drugstore. Ruth told him not to worry about material things, that the spirit was what mattered. But Walter insisted that she deserved at least a little comfort. One afternoon, as the sky turned orange and buzzards circled over the dump, Walter looked at the small corner where Ruth lived and thought he couldn't let her keep sleeping on wet cardboard. He said he was going to build her a decent shelter, something to protect her from the wind and rain. She replied that it wasn't necessary, that she was used to the elements. But he insisted with a firmness that surprised her. He said that if she had been his salvation, he must be her shelter. He spent the next few days looking for pieces of wood, rusty nails, scraps of sheet metal, and anything that could be used to build a small shack. Ruth watched him work from her corner, and sometimes approached to offer him water or to pray while he hammered. She said it had been a long time since she had heard the sound of someone building something out of love, that the sound reminded her of the days when her husband was alive and they built their old wooden house together. Walter smiled and told her he didn't know if it was love or gratitude, but what he felt for her was stronger than any obligation. When he finished, the shelter was small but sturdy, with walls of old wood and a makeshift roof that held back the rain. Inside, he placed a bed made of planks covered with clean cloths, and in the center, the altar of the Virgin that Ruth had kept since the first night. She knelt before the image and said it was the most beautiful place she had been in years. Walter replied that it wasn't the place that mattered, but the people who filled it with meaning. From then on, life at the dump took on a different rhythm. The other homeless people began to visit the small shelter, drawn by the peace that emanated from it. Some came to ask for food, others simply to listen to the old woman's stories. Ruth spoke to them of forgiveness, of hope, of children who sometimes get lost but never stop being children. She recounted with a soft voice how she had raised her only daughter alone, how poverty had always been her companion, and how, in the end, the closest heart had become the most distant. Walter listened in silence, a mixture of anger and sadness in his eyes. One night, he asked her why she had never hated her daughter after what she did. Ruth replied that hating was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, that resentment only feeds the misery of the soul. She said that faith had taught her that every human being has their own time to understand love, and that her daughter would one day realize what she had lost. Walter bowed his head, moved, and said that if he had had a mother like her, his life would have been different. Ruth looked at him tenderly and replied that it's never too late to have a mother, that love doesn't need blood or a last name to be real. From that night on, they began to call each other mother and son. She cared for him as if he were her own child, and he protected her with a devotion born only of gratitude. Every dawn, he accompanied her to look for food or to talk to the vendors who left scraps near the market. The people from the neighborhood began to recognize them, to greet them with respect. Some neighbors even started leaving them clothes or food. The rumors about the old saint of the dump spread, and many came to ask for her blessing. Ruth always said she was no saint, just a woman who had learned not to give up. Walter would watch her as she spoke, admiring the peace she radiated, even in the most absolute poverty. One day, as they shared a piece of bread at sunset, Walter told her he didn't want her to keep living in the trash. He said he had found a small, abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, near a field where he could work and where the air was clean. He proposed that they go together, that he would take care of her as if she were his own mother. Ruth was silent for a long time, looking at the distant city lights. She said that this dump had been her refuge when no one else wanted her, that she had learned to forgive there, and that leaving it felt like closing a chapter. Walter took her hand and told her she wasn't closing anything. She was just starting something new. He explained that he didn't want to see her get sick or die in this place, that she deserved to spend her final years surrounded by love and dignity. Ruth sighed and said that perhaps God was showing her the way once more. The next morning, they packed the few things they had: the rosary, the image of the Virgin, the blanket, and an old photo Ruth kept from her youth. Walter slung the suitcase over his shoulder, and together they began to walk down the path leading out of the dump. The sun was in their faces, and the fresh air of the countryside filled their lungs. Ruth looked back one last time and said that her past remained there, but her heart was leaving in peace. Walter replied that from that day on, she would never be alone again, that as long as he breathed, she would have a son who loved and protected her. They walked out of that dump not as two broken people, but as a family. She was finally safe. But their story is far from over. Destiny still had one more person to bring into their new life. And so, walking slowly in the dawn light, a forgotten old woman and a reborn man began a new life, united not by blood, but by the purest miracle that exists, love born from the soul. The journey to the new house was long and quiet, but it wasn't a sad silence. It was a silence full of promise, the kind that comes when the soul begins to heal after knowing the abyss. Walter walked slowly, making sure Miss Ruth didn't trip on the rocks in the path. He carried the old suitcase on his shoulder and, in his other hand, held the small image of the Virgin Mary that the old woman had rescued from the dump. The sun began to set behind the hills, and the cool air smelled of damp earth and open fields. Ruth, with her gray shawl covering her head, walked with short but firm steps, looking around as if every tree and every cloud were signs of God's forgiveness. When they finally reached the small plot of land where Walter had prepared the little house, Ruth stopped for a moment in front of the door. It was a simple structure, made of wood and old shingles, but it had a window where the golden light of sunset streamed in. Walter told her it wasn't much, but he had put his heart into every nail, every board. Ruth replied that it was more beautiful than any palace, because it was built with love, and love was the only wealth that doesn't corrupt. They entered together, and the inside greeted them with the smell of new wood and hope. In a corner, Walter had placed a bed with clean sheets, and on the wall, a wooden cross. Ruth brought her hands to her face and began to cry silently. She said she hadn't slept in a real bed in years, that the body gets used to the floor, but the soul never stops yearning for dignified rest. Walter approached and told her this place was hers, that she could call it home. She stroked the blanket with her wrinkled fingers and thanked him, saying she never imagined she would again have a roof where she could sleep without fear. That night, after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Ruth lay down in the bed. The mattress creaked under her weight, and she closed her eyes, feeling every fiber embrace her. She prayed an Our Father and a Hail Mary before sleeping, and for the first time in many months, sleep enveloped her without tears. Walter watched her from the doorway and thought he had never seen so much peace in a human face. At dawn, the sounds of the countryside woke her. Birds were singing, and the wind made the branches of the tree in front of the house tap gently on the window. She sat up slowly with a smile. She said that was the sound of heaven, that peace must sound like this. Walter was already outside chopping firewood. When he saw her come out, he told her he had made strong black coffee and that its aroma was the sign of a new beginning. Ruth looked at him tenderly and replied that life always offers second chances, but only the humble recognize them. The following days were a blessing for both of them. The neighborhood began to notice the old woman's arrival. At first, the children peeked curiously, asking who the white-haired woman was who smiled at everyone. The women of the neighborhood, accustomed to gossip, soon surrendered to her sweetness. Ruth greeted every person who passed, offering blessings and words of comfort. She said that every face hid a story, and that listening to one's neighbor was a way of praying. Soon, the neighbors began to visit her. Some brought bread, others flowers or fruit, and she always had kind words for them. She told them how life can be reborn even from the refuse, and that true love knows no boundaries. Walter marveled, watching how this woman's presence transformed everything around her. Where there was once distrust and distance, there was now unity. One Sunday, as the sun lit up the small living room, Walter said they should do something special to give thanks for all they had received. He proposed building an altar with the image of the Virgin she had saved from the dump. Ruth was thrilled and said it was a beautiful idea because that image had witnessed her pain and would now witness her hope. They found an old table, cleaned it, and covered it with a white cloth. On top, they placed flowers from the garden, a lit candle, and the image of the Virgin, which, though broken and worn, radiated an inexplicable beauty. Ruth said the Virgin didn't need to be new, because true love also has scars. That night, they prayed together in front of the altar. Walter asked for strength, and gave thanks for finding his spiritual mother. Ruth asked for health to continue giving love. When they finished, the silence that enveloped them was so profound it felt like a caress. In the following days, neighbors passing by the house would stop at the window to look at the altar. Some left flowers, others lit candles. Soon, they began to call it the Virgin's house, a place where people went to seek comfort. Ruth always received them with humility, offered them coffee, and listened. She said that if life had thrown her in the trash only to lift her up again, it was because she was meant to be a bridge between despair and faith. The rumors spread beyond the neighborhood. People came from other places, drawn by the story of the old woman who had turned her suffering into a blessing. Some asked her for advice. Others simply sat in silence by her side. Ruth said she had no answers, only faith, and that faith was enough to sustain a weary soul. Walter watched it all with admiration and gratitude. He felt part of something sacred, as if his life, which had once been full of noise and ambition, had finally found a purpose. One afternoon, as they were both watering the plants growing in front of the house, Ruth said she had never imagined that peace had the shape of a home. She said that hell wasn't a place full of fire, but the absence of love, and that she now understood she had escaped hers thanks to a son not born of her womb, but of her compassion. Walter replied that she had taught him what it truly meant to live, that her presence had cleaned the soul he carried, stained by fear and violence. She smiled and told him that life is wise, because sometimes it brings the broken together so they can repair each other. As the sun began to set that evening, They both sat on the porch. The sky burned in shades of orange and pink, and a flock of birds crossed the horizon. Ruth looked at the altar from the doorway and said that if she died one day, she wanted people to remember this place, not for her, but for the miracle of faith. She said the flowers would wither, but the light of the Virgin would remain lit in the hearts that had learned to love without expecting anything in return. Walter took her hand and told her that as long as he lived, her story would not be lost. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and replied that this was enough to die in peace when the time came. But the time had not yet come. Life continued to call her every morning with the song of birds and the murmur of the neighbors' prayers. The Virgin's house became a refuge for the sad, a beacon for the desperate, a symbol that even after the cruelest hell, hope can be reborn if the heart stays clean. And so, amid prayers, smiles, and golden afternoons, Ruth discovered that true peace is not found in forgetting the past, but in transforming it into light. One hot afternoon, when the air smelled of dry earth and the sun seemed to melt the shadows, Walter returned from the market with a small, old radio he had managed to repair with parts a neighbor gave him. He said that way they could listen to music or news while they worked in the garden behind the house. Ruth smiled gratefully and replied that it had been years since she'd heard a voice that wasn't her own or the birds', that silence had been her companion for too long. Walter placed the radio on the table, turned the knob carefully, and after a crackle of static, a newscaster's voice began to fill the air. It was a local news program, one of those that repeat crimes and suspects' names as if it were part of a daily ritual. As they prepared homemade bread, their hands covered in flour, Ruth hummed a prayer, and Walter listened distractedly until a sentence made him freeze. The announcer reported that a woman named Stephanie Hunter had been arrested for fraud and money laundering. He said her accomplice, a man named Gregory Davis, had disappeared, taking all the victims' money. Walter slowly turned down the volume and looked at Ruth. She was still kneading the bread, oblivious to the words that had just been spoken. Walter felt a lump in his throat. He knew he had to tell her, but he also feared breaking the sacred calm that enveloped the house. He took a breath and said he had heard a news report about a woman named Stephanie Hunter. Ruth stopped moving her hands and looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and premonition. She asked in a low voice what they said about her. Walter hesitated for a few seconds and then replied that they were talking about an arrest, about fraud, about a man who had betrayed her and fled. There was a dense silence, as if the world had stopped for an instant. Ruth lowered her gaze, took a deep breath, and said she knew. Something in her heart had warned her for a long time that her daughter was lost not just from her, but from herself. Walter rushed to say she shouldn't worry, that human justice is sometimes cruel, that maybe it was all a mistake, but she gently shook her head and replied that it was no mistake, that when you build your life on ambition, the castle always crumbles. She said she didn't wish her harm, because a mother never stops loving, even when her child walks into darkness. She sat in a chair by the window and looked at the horizon. Her eyes shed no tears, but the glint in them was of an ancient, deep sadness. She said her daughter's punishment wasn't prison, but loneliness, and that the pain of being betrayed by the man she chose would be stronger than any bars. Walter clenched his fists in anger and said that this Gregory deserved to pay for what he'd done, that abandoning a woman was an act of cowardice. But Ruth interrupted him, saying that divine justice arrives without being sought, and it wasn't her place to judge anyone. She said she preferred to pray for both of them, because perhaps Gregory was also lost, and mercy reaches even those who don't ask for it. Then she took her rosary and began to pray in a low voice, her lips moving with a devotion that was deeply moving. Walter sat across from her, watching her with a respect that bordered on reverence. He thought he had never met anyone with such strength, someone capable of transforming pain into prayer. That night, while the house slept under a blanket of stars, Ruth got up without making a sound, lit the candle in front of the image of the Virgin, and spoke silently with her. She said she wasn't asking for miracles, only that her daughter might find the light before she died, that she might understand that wealth provides no warmth when the soul trembles with emptiness. She asked for strength not to fall into bitterness and to continue loving without expecting anything in return. Her hands trembled as she held the rosary, but her voice was firm, as if the pain made her stronger. The next morning, as the sun began to filter through the window, Walter found her baking bread. She said she hadn't slept, that she needed to keep her hands busy so her heart wouldn't break. She explained that she had decided to sell bread and dried flowers at the market, that every dollar she earned, she would save to help someone who needed it more than her. Walter asked with some concern what she planned to do with that money, and she replied that acts of love aren't announced, that the left hand shouldn't know what the right is doing. He understood there was something in her gaze, a silent decision, but he didn't press. The days passed, and Ruth began her routine. She woke up early, prepared the loaves with flour, water, and faith, and wrapped them in a white cloth. Then she would go out, accompanied by Walter, and they would walk to the market. The neighbors greeted her. People smiled when they saw her. Some bought out of affection more than hunger. They said her bread had a different taste, as if it were made with hope. In the afternoons, she collected flowers from the field, dried them in the sun, and sold them as blessed bouquets. Walter told her she shouldn't work so hard, but she replied that life had given her a new chance, and she had to give back to the world a little of what she had received. At night, she counted the coins and put them in a small box under the altar, without saying a word about their purpose. Each coin was a prayer, a hidden gesture of love that kept her alive. Walter suspected that money had a greater destiny than themselves, but he respected her silence. She didn't celebrate. She started baking. Every coin she earned was a prayer, a quiet act of love. Walter didn't know it, but Ruth was preparing for her final and greatest act of motherhood. Deep down, he knew this old woman did nothing by chance, that her every act was a seed of faith. One day, as the sun was setting and the smell of fresh bread filled the house, Walter told her he admired her capacity to forgive. She replied that forgiving wasn't forgetting, but freeing the soul from the weight of resentment. She said life had taught her that even the deepest wounds can turn into flowers if they are watered with faith. And as she spoke, her hands continued to knead the dough with the same gentleness with which she caressed the rosary. As time went on, rumors about Stephanie's story arrived from the city, sadder and more confusing each time. Ruth listened in silence and said nothing. She only prayed. She never spoke her daughter's name in vain. She never cursed her. In her heart, she was still the little girl running through the yard with a ribbon in her hair. That image accompanied her every night when sleep mixed with memories, and the whisper of her prayers filled the room. She thought about her daughter's fate, realizing the true punishment for ambition wasn't losing everything, but forgetting what truly mattered in the first place. That's why, as the candle flames danced before the altar, Ruth promised she would not let her love for her daughter die, because even the most withered flower can be reborn if someone believes in it. The dawn of that day had a different tone, as if the sky knew something important was about to happen. The wind blew gently through the trees, and the sound of distant bells announced the start of a day that would mark the destiny of a mother and daughter separated by pain. Miss Ruth woke before dawn, her body tired but her soul firm. She sat on the edge of the bed, took her rosary, and held it between her fingers as she looked at the image of the Virgin hanging on the wall. She said the time had come to do the right thing, even if her heart was trembling. Walter, who was sleeping in the next room, heard her praying and came over. He asked if it wasn't too early to go out, and she replied that true acts of love don't wait for sunlight, because they are born in silence. Walter watched her silently, noticing the paleness of her face and the determination in her eyes. He asked if she was sure about what she wanted to do, and Ruth replied that a mother doesn't seek justice, she seeks redemption. She said she couldn't die knowing her daughter was suffering, even if that suffering was the result of her own mistakes. Walter insisted on accompanying her, and she accepted with a faint smile, saying she didn't want to face life's judgment alone. They prepared a small breakfast, shared bread and coffee, and then headed into town. The walk to the courthouse was long and dusty. Ruth walked slowly, leaning on her cane, while Walter carried a small bag holding the savings she had gathered over months of selling bread and flowers. Neither spoke, but they both knew that money wasn't just a sum of coins. It was the result of every prayer, every sacrifice, and every day of work under the Sunday. When they arrived, the building stood imposing with its gray walls and worn wooden door. Ruth stopped for a moment at the entrance and said that forgiveness isn't asked for with words, but with actions. They climbed the stairs and entered the hallway, where the echo of voices and footsteps rumbled as if the place breathed both guilt and hope. Walter spoke to a clerk, explaining that his mother wanted to pay a bail. The man, with an impatient gesture, asked for the detainee's name, and Ruth pronounced softly, "Stephanie Hunter." The clerk typed on his computer and said the amount was high, that she had to pay in cash and sign the documents. Ruth opened the bag and placed the money on the counter. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from emotion. The man looked at her, surprised, perhaps expecting an explanation, but she only said she was a friend of the family and didn't wish to leave her name. Walter watched her in silence, understanding that she didn't want her daughter to know who had saved her. This is the definition of unconditional love. To save the very person who tried to destroy you, and to do it in secret, asking for nothing in return. She didn't just pay Stephanie's bail. She gave her a path to freedom. He thought this was the purest form of love, the kind that seeks no recognition. When she finished signing the papers, Ruth took a deep breath and said it was done, that the weight she carried in her soul had been given to heaven. The clerk informed her the woman would be released that same afternoon. Walter offered to help her sit down, noticing her legs were shaking. She said she was fine, that the body gets tired, but the heart was at peace. As they left the building, the sun blinded them for a moment, and Ruth looked up at the sky. She said that mercy needs no witnesses, it's enough that God sees it. Walter asked if she didn't want to wait to see her daughter come out, but she said no, that her presence would only reopen wounds that needed to heal on their own. She said she preferred to keep the image of Stephanie as a child, when she would hug her without fear and tell her she loved her. They returned home, walking slowly. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was the silence of those who know that words are unnecessary when love has spoken for itself. When they arrived, Ruth went straight to the altar, lit a new candle, knelt, and thanked the Virgin for allowing her to fulfill her last mission. She said forgiveness was the key that opens the soul's doors, and now she could rest, knowing her daughter would have a new chance. Her eyes shone with tears, but they were serene tears, the kind that cleanse and don't hurt. Walter approached and placed a blanket over her shoulders, telling her she should rest. She smiled and replied yes, that her body was asking for it, but her soul still had something to say. That night, as the wind blew through the leaves in the garden, Ruth took paper and a pen and sat at the table. The candle flame flickered on the altar, casting shadows that seemed to move to the rhythm of her breathing. She took a breath and began to write. The words came out slowly, loaded with emotion, as if each letter were a farewell. She wrote that love holds no grudges, that prison wasn't her daughter's punishment, but the chance life was giving her to start over. She said she didn't hate her, that she had loved her every day, even when the world tried to convince her otherwise. She asked her not to cry at her death when it came, but to live by helping the forgotten, because in them was the reflection of her own story. As she wrote, her pulse grew weaker, and she had to stop several times to breathe. Walter came in and found her with the pen in her hand. He asked what she was doing, and she replied that she was leaving her last gift. She asked him that when she was gone, he should give this letter to Stephanie without saying another word. Walter tried to convince her to rest, but she said the soul cannot sleep when it still has something to give. She finished the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in an envelope, which she sealed with a kiss. Then she left it under the image of the Virgin. She said that now she could rest. That night, the exhaustion seemed to settle deep into her bones. When Walter came to check on her, she was asleep, but her breathing was shallow. He knew, with a heavy heart, that this was the beginning of the end. On the altar, the candle remained lit, illuminating the envelope as if heaven wanted to guard her last words. Walter sat beside her, holding her hand, not knowing this would be one of the last nights he would hear her voice. Outside, the wind brought the murmur of the river, and the moon, a silent witness, watched as a mother's sacrifice became the purest expression of love. The dawn broke with a silence that hung heavy in the air, a different silence, as if the world were holding its breath before a final sigh. Miss Ruth had been in bed for days, wrapped in a white blanket Walter had placed on her tenderly. Her body, once small but strong, now seemed to fade slowly, like a flame burning without complaint until it extinguishes. Her fever rose and fell, and her breathing was short, shallow, almost a whisper. Walter never left her side. He spent the night sitting in a chair by the bed, his gaze fixed on the face of the woman who had become his spiritual mother. Outside, the wind moved the leaves of the apple tree they had planted together, and every rustle of the air seemed to bring a memory, a prayer, a promise. Walter had called the town doctor, but the man, after examining her, told him there wasn't much to be done. He explained that age and fatigue had consumed her body, that her heart was fighting on only out of love. When the doctor left, Walter remained alone with her. He took her hand and said she had to rest, that soon she would be walking in the garden again and baking bread. Ruth looked at him sweetly and replied that he shouldn't deceive himself, that she knew the end was near, but there was no fear in her soul. She said she had lived long enough to understand that death wasn't a punishment, but a return, that heaven isn't in the sky, but in the heart of one who loves without measure. Walter wanted to deny those words, but she stopped him with a calm look, a look that pierced him to his core. She said he had to promise her something, and he nodded without hesitation. Ruth squeezed his hand with the little strength she had left, and asked him that if he ever found her daughter, he shouldn't judge her, but take care of her. She said Stephanie had lost her way, but her soul was still alive, and that God puts in the paths of men the souls that must redeem one another. Walter felt a lump in his throat and replied that he swore it, that if destiny brought them together, he would treat her like a sister, like a sacred promise. Ruth closed her eyes and smiled. She said then she could go in peace, because the love one heart leaves in another never goes out. The day advanced slowly, with a calm that seemed infinite. Ruth asked for the window to be opened so she could feel the fresh air, and Walter obediently did so. The wind entered softly, moving the curtains as if they were angels' wings. On the table, the altar candle had been burning since the night before, consuming itself slowly, dripping wax that fell like tears on the cloth. Ruth fixed her gaze on the flame and said that light was her mirror, that just as the candle gives its life to illuminate, she had given hers to love. Walter couldn't hold back his tears. He asked her not to talk like that he needed her, that without her, the house would be just empty walls. She replied that love doesn't die with the body, that as long as he remembered her words, her spirit would continue to inhabit the home. She asked him not to cry, that tears are the language of those who don't understand that heaven isn't lost, it just changes location. Hours passed, and evening began to fall. The sun filtered through the window, painting the room in golden hues. Ruth asked for her rosary. She took it in her fingers, caressed it like an old friend, and began to pray. Her lips moved slowly, and although her voice was weak, every word was full of faith. She said she forgave her daughter, Gregory, everyone who had ever hurt her. She said resentment had been her prison and forgiveness her freedom. Then she looked at Walter and said he shouldn't blame himself for anything, that he had been her miracle. She said God had sent him to remind her that love doesn't need blood, only soul. Walter took her hands and kissed them with devotion. He said he didn't know how to go on without her, that she had filled a void he didn't even know he had. Ruth looked at him with infinite tenderness and replied that he must continue living to help others, that this was his purpose, that love isn't measured by time shared, but by what it leaves in the hearts of others. Outside, it began to rain, a soft rain that fell like a blessing. Ruth took a deep breath, looked at the sky, and murmured, barely audible, that the Lord forgive her, just as she had forgiven. Her body relaxed, and a profound peace spread through the room. Walter felt her hand go light in his. Her earthly journey was over. Ruth passed peacefully, having given every last ounce of love she possessed, leaving behind a profound promise that would connect her past to her future. He called her name, but there was no answer. Silence enveloped everything, a pure, almost sacred silence. The candle was still lit, the flame still, unmoving, as if it, too, were paying respect. Walter stayed there for a long time, looking at her, his face soaked in tears. He said in a low voice that she had fulfilled her mission, that heaven must be receiving her with flowers. He stood up slowly, took the white shawl she used to cover herself when she prayed, and spread it over her body. Kneeling before the altar, he prayed for her soul, but also for his own, which felt broken. Outside, the sky cleared, and a ray of light pierced the window, illuminating the old woman's serene face. Walter thought that death hadn't come to take her life, but to return it to its origin. He didn't sleep that night. He stayed by her side, watching over her rest as the candle slowly consumed itself until it became a small ember. When the flame finally went out, the room was left in shadow, but he felt there was no darkness. He said that Miss Ruth's light would live on in every corner of that house, in every shared piece of bread, in every prayer. And so, as the night covered the world with its cloak, a mother's love ascended to heaven, leaving behind a fragrance of peace that no wind could ever erase. The afternoon Stephanie got out of prison. The sky was covered in gray clouds, and the air had that damp smell rain leaves just before it falls. She walked slowly, with uncertain steps, as if the ground felt unfamiliar after so many days locked within cold walls and heavy silences. She wore the same clothes she had been arrested in, a wrinkled dress she no longer remembered when she had last washed. In her hands, she held a plastic bag with a few belongings: a broken comb, a rosary a cellmate had given her, and her release papers signed in blue ink. She didn't know who had paid her bail. No one had told her anything. They just informed her she could go, that she was free. But that word, free, sounded empty, almost ironic. Outside, no one was waiting for her. She looked around and felt a pang in her chest. She thought maybe Gregory would be waiting for her somewhere. But she immediately remembered that he had betrayed her, taken the money, and left her to her fate. She closed her eyes for a few seconds and took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. She said in a low voice that she wouldn't cry anymore, that she had no tears left to waste. She began to walk aimlessly, crossing streets that seemed alien, watching people pass by with the hurry of those who still have something to live for. No one looked at her. No one recognized her. She felt invisible, like a shadow gliding through the world's noise. After a few hours, she reached a small park, sat on a bench, and took out the rosary. She looked at it with a mixture of anger and sadness, remembering that her mother had always told her that faith was the only wealth man could not steal. She muttered to herself that she wished she had listened to those words before, when she could still change the course of her life. Then a voice interrupted her. It was a young man selling bread and flowers. He offered her a warm loaf, saying his boss had baked it, a good man who helped the needy. Stephanie looked at him, not understanding, and asked who this boss was. The young man replied his name was Walter, that he had a small house on the outskirts of town, known as the Virgin's House. Hearing that name, Stephanie felt a chill, though she didn't know why. She asked the boy if he could tell her how to get there, and he kindly pointed the way. She walked for hours, until the sun began to hide behind the hills. Her feet ached, and exhaustion forced her to stop several times, but something inside urged her on. An inner voice whispered that at the end of that road, she would find something more than shelter. When she arrived, she saw a small house with light-colored walls, a garden full of flowers, and an altar visible from the window. In the center, a lit candle illuminated the image of the Virgin Mary. Stephanie stared for a long time, feeling a lump in her throat. She knocked on the door shyly, and it was Walter who came out to greet her. He observed her for a few seconds, the exhausted posture, the deep sadness in her eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked gently. The woman looked at the small altar through the doorway, her voice barely a whisper. I'm looking for Ruth, or someone who knew her. My name is Stephanie Hunter." Walter's expression softened. He recognized the name that had been the subject of so many of Ruth's prayers. He nodded slowly and asked her to come in. She said she had heard his name in prison and didn't understand who had helped her. Walter took a deep breath and replied that it had been her mother. Stephanie frowned, not understanding. "What mother?" she asked. Because hers had been dead to her for a long time. Walter shook his head slowly and asked her to come in. Inside, the air smelled of freshly baked bread and dried flowers. On a table next to the altar was a white envelope sealed with wax. Walter motioned for her to sit and told her that envelope belonged to her, that her mother had left it for her before she passed. Stephanie froze, her eyes fixed on that piece of paper that seemed to contain her entire life. She asked with a trembling voice if her mother was alive, and Walter replied, no, that she had passed away peacefully a short time ago, praying for her until her last breath. Stephanie covered her face with her hands and murmured that it couldn't be true, that she didn't deserve her prayers, that she had been an ungrateful daughter. Walter approached her and said that her mother never hated her, that she only waited for the day when love could overcome pride. He handed her the envelope and stepped back, leaving her alone with her pain. Stephanie held the letter in her hands, unable to open it. The wax broke easily, and inside, she found a yellowish paper with her mother's shaky handwriting. She began to read, and as the words progressed, the tears began to fall. It said, "I hold no grudge, daughter. Prison is not your punishment, but your path to freedom. God only lets us hit bottom so we can learn to look up." It said she had always prayed for her, that she loved her even when the whole world turned its back on her, that her greatest wish was to see her happy and at peace. It said that forgiveness isn't asked for, it's given, and that her mother gave it to her completely, without conditions. At the end, the words faded into an almost illegible line, which said that a mother's love doesn't die with the body, it lives in the heart of the child who learns to forgive. Stephanie dropped the letter on the table and broke down sobbing. That is the sound of a heart breaking and healing all at once. The full, crushing weight of her mother's sacrifice and her own terrible mistake finally came crashing down. This is the moment her redemption truly begins. She screamed that it was too late, that she could no longer ask for forgiveness, that she had wasted her life chasing money when all she ever needed was love. Walter came over and hugged her, holding her as her body shook. He told her it wasn't too late, that her mother hadn't died completely, that as long as her words lived in that letter and in her heart, she was still present. Stephanie cried for a long time until exhaustion overcame her. When she looked up, she noticed the altar candle was still lit, the flame moving with an almost human gentleness, as if an invisible hand were caressing it. She knelt before the image of the Virgin and said that if her mother could see her, she promised to change, to care for the forgotten, and to live the way she would have wanted. Walter watched her in silence, his eyes moist. He said that this was the only inheritance Ruth had left, an inheritance of faith, love, and redemption. That night, as the wind blew and the stars appeared one by one, Stephanie slept peacefully for the first time, with the letter on her chest. Though the world didn't know it, in that humble house, a mother's voice was still alive, guiding with her light the daughter who had finally learned what it meant to forgive. The morning dawned, quietly, with a sun that filtered through the curtains and bathed the room in a warm light. But for Stephanie, the world was still in shadow. She had spent the night awake, sitting by the altar where the candle still burned, consuming itself slowly, as if her mother were still watching from some invisible corner. In front of her, on the table, was the portrait of Miss Ruth, an old photograph in which the old woman smiled with that serenity only souls who have made peace with life possess. Stephanie watched it, her eyes swollen from crying, and said in a low voice that now she understood what true love was, the kind that asks for nothing in return and gives itself even when it has been betrayed. She knelt before the portrait and clasped her trembling hands. She murmured that she didn't deserve her forgiveness, that she had been blind, selfish, that she had chosen ambition over blood, and that money had become her god. She said she now understood that the greatest punishment hadn't been prison, but the guilt that followed her like a shadow. Tears fell uncontrollably, soaking the floor. Her voice broke as she pleaded for her mother in heaven to hear her repentance. She said she wasn't asking to be forgiven, because that had already been done, but for her mother to teach her how to forgive herself, because the remorse burned her soul like an unquenchable fire. Silence filled the house, and for an instant she thought she heard a gentle breeze move the flowers on the altar. It was as if the air whispered her name, as if her mother were answering without words. Then she felt a slight peace, just a moment of relief in the storm. Walter entered slowly, and seeing her on her knees, understood what was happening. He approached without a word, helped her up, and led her to the table. She couldn't stop crying. She said she felt empty, that she didn't know how to go on after destroying so much. Walter took her hands and said calmly that she mustn't keep punishing herself, that her mother hadn't judged her, that until her last day, she spoke only of love. He said Ruth died in peace because her heart never knew hatred, and that if she wanted to honor her memory, she must do the same. Love even those who don't deserve it, as her mother did with her. Stephanie looked at him with red eyes and said she didn't think she could, that the guilt was too great. Walter replied that forgiveness isn't felt, it's decided, and that when one chooses to love, guilt loses its power. She fell silent, thinking about those words, which sounded like an echo of her mother's teachings. She asked Walter what it had been like to live with her, and he replied that Ruth had a heart so big that even poverty seemed lighter by her side. He said she never spoke ill of anyone, that every day began with a prayer and ended with an act of kindness. He told her how she sold bread and flowers to help others, and how she always repeated that love was the only wealth that multiplies when shared. Stephanie closed her eyes, imagining her mother in those days fragile but strong, walking among people with a smile that lit up even misery. She said she didn't deserve to have been her daughter, but Walter gently interrupted her, saying she shouldn't talk like that her mother had chosen her even before she was born, that a mother's love doesn't depend on merit, but on devotion. Stephanie took a deep breath and said that if there was still a way to repair the damage, she would find it. She said she wanted to live like her mother, serving, loving, healing what she could. Walter nodded, moved, and told her that was what Ruth would have wanted, that she didn't need penance, but purpose. That afternoon, they went for a walk through the town. The sky had cleared, and the air had a scent of damp earth that brought a feeling of rebirth. They passed a small church, and Stephanie stopped. She looked at the open doors and said she hadn't entered a holy place in years. Walter encouraged her to. Inside, incense hung in the air, and a group of elderly people prayed in low voices. Stephanie knelt in the last pew and closed her eyes. She told the Lord she didn't know how to pray like her mother, but her soul was tired and needed guidance. She asked for strength to change, to transform her guilt into service. When they left, she saw a sign in front of a building that read Street Vincent's Home, Shelter for the Elderly. She asked what it was, and Walter explained it was a nursing home for abandoned people, supported by donations. Stephanie stared at the entrance for a long time, watching a nurse push a wheelchair and an old man smile with gratitude. She said she felt something strange, a call in her chest. Walter looked at her and smiled, knowing what she was thinking. He told her that this was her place, that life was offering her the chance to do for others what her mother had done for her. Stephanie went in without hesitation, spoke to the director, and asked for a job, even if it was just cleaning the halls or washing clothes. The woman looked at her, surprised, but saw sincerity in her eyes and accepted. That same afternoon, she began helping in the kitchen, serving soup and bread to the elderly. At first, some looked at her with suspicion, but soon her kindness began to soften their gazes. She would stop to talk with them, to listen to their stories, to hold their trembling hands. She said that in their eyes, she saw her mother's loneliness reflected, and that every smile she managed to draw was a prayer answered. Walter visited her often, bringing her flowers for the altar she had improvised in a corner of the home. One night, as she was closing the windows, Stephanie told him she had decided to dedicate the rest of her life to those no one wants, because she understood that in every forgotten elderly person lived a piece of her mother's heart. She said caring for them was her way of asking for forgiveness, but also of giving thanks. Walter listened in silence and said Ruth would be proud, that she must be smiling from heaven. Stephanie looked up at the stars and replied that she felt her presence in every kind gesture, in every face she caressed, in every word of comfort. That night, as she walked home, the wind blew softly, and for an instant, she thought she heard her mother's voice, saying she was at peace. And for the first time in many years, Stephanie smiled without guilt, her soul light, knowing that redemption is not found in forgetting, but in the transformation of the heart. The dawn came slowly over the city, painting the sky in golden and pink hues that seemed to announce a new chapter, not just for the day, but for the soul. At Street Vincent's home, Stephanie began her day as always, lighting a candle in front of a small image of the Virgin and giving thanks for waking up with the strength to serve. She had been there for months now, and although her body had grown used to the fatigue of caring for others, her heart never grew accustomed to the emotion she felt every time a wrinkled hand clung to hers, seeking comfort. That morning, as she served breakfast to the residents, a nurse told her a new resident had just arrived, an older woman brought in by a neighbor who found her wandering the streets. Stephanie approached curiously, and saw her sitting in a chair by the window. She was an old woman with white hair and a face weathered by the years, her gaze lost on the horizon. She had thin hands and a broken rosary hanging from her neck. Stephanie leaned in and asked her name. The woman replied in a trembling voice that her name was Beatrice, and she couldn't remember how long it had been since she'd spoken to anyone. She said her children had left her at a bus station, and that she had been walking aimlessly ever since, hoping God would take her where she needed to be. Stephanie felt a lump in her throat, because in those words she saw her mother's story reflected the same abandonment, the same sadness hidden behind an unbreakable faith. It was like looking at a reflection of her own mother. Life was giving Stephanie a second chance, a chance to do for Beatrice what she failed to do for Ruth. The question is, will she take it? She took her hand and told her she wasn't alone, that she had a place now, and that she would take care of her. Beatrice looked up and smiled, her eyes moist. She said no one had spoken to her with such sweetness in years. From that day on, Stephanie accompanied her in everything. She helped her walk, combed her hair, read her prayers, and served her food with the same tenderness Ruth had given bread to Walter years ago. Every gesture, every word, was a sacred repetition of the legacy her mother had left. At night, when the others slept, Stephanie would sit with Beatrice, and they would talk about life. The old woman shared that she'd had 3 children who drifted away after her husband died. At first, they visited, but over time, they stopped. She said that at first, she prayed for their return, but later understood that love cannot be forced, that the heart stays where it is remembered. Stephanie told her that her mother had taught her the same thing, that to love is not to possess, but to set free. She confessed her own story, told her about her ambition, her fall, her mother, and the letter that had changed her life. Beatrice listened in silence, tears in her eyes, and when she finished, she said Ruth must be very proud, because there is no greater miracle than a soul transformed by forgiveness. As the weeks passed, the connection between them became so deep that Stephanie began to affectionately call her, "my old lady." And Beatrice would reply, "daughter," with a tenderness that time cannot erase. One day, while sweeping the courtyard of the home, Stephanie looked at Beatrice sleeping in the sun and thought that her mother had guided her to her. She said in a low voice that she couldn't let this woman die in such a cold place, that she had to fulfill Ruth's wish to care for the forgotten. That same afternoon, she spoke to Walter and told him her decision. She said she wanted to bring Miss Beatrice to live with her, in the house where her mother had died. Walter looked at her, surprised, but understood immediately. He told her Ruth would have done the same, that this home was always destined to be a refuge for those who had no one. A few days passed, and with the help of neighbors, they organized the move. When Beatrice arrived at the house, she stopped in front of the altar where the image of the Virgin Mary still shone. She looked at it, moved, and said the place smelled of love, that she could feel the presence of something divine. Stephanie helped her sit down and explained that this house had belonged to a woman who had loved beyond pain, a woman who had turned her poverty into riches for others. She said her name was Ruth, and that from that day on, this house would also be hers. Beatrice cried silently and replied that she could die in peace now, because she had found a daughter on her path. Stephanie hugged her and told her not to talk about dying, but about living with gratitude for the time that remained. From then on, the days passed with laughter, prayers, and warm bread. Walter, inspired by Stephanie's devotion, decided to take it a step further. He said he couldn't let Ruth's goodness stay within 4 walls. It had to expand, to multiply. Thus, the idea for the shelter was born. With the help of neighbors, he built a few rooms behind the house and filled them with simple beds, clean blankets, and fresh flowers. They painted the walls white and placed a sign at the entrance that read Street Ruth's Home. When Stephanie saw it finished, she couldn't hold back her tears. She said this was her mother's final miracle, that her love had transcended death to become living hope. Slowly, more elderly people began to arrive, men and women without families, the sick, tired souls who found not just a roof, but affection. Stephanie welcomed them all with a smile, remembering the words her mother had written. "Prison was not your punishment, daughter, but your path to freedom." Now she understood that phrase wasn't just about her, but about all who arrived seeking redemption. Every night before sleeping, she would walk down the hall and look into the rooms, making sure everyone was comfortable. On the altar, the candle never went out, a symbol of Ruth's eternal light. Walter used to say that flame was like the old woman's heart, always lit, illuminating the shadows. One day, they placed a metal plaque at the entrance of the shelter. Stephanie cleaned it with her own hands until it shined in the sunday. Engraved on it were the words Ruth used to repeat, "The heart that gives never dies." Stephanie read it aloud, feeling a shiver. She looked at the sky and murmured that her mother was still alive, that her love hadn't ended in the dump where it all began, but had flourished in every soul touched by her legacy. She said she now understood the true meaning of forgiveness, not to erase the past, but to transform it into light. As the sun set and the birds returned to their nests, Stephanie sat with Beatrice in the garden, took her hand, and said that when she looked at the sky, she felt her mother watching her with pride. Beatrice smiled and replied that true love never leaves, it just changes its address. And there, amid the murmur of the wind and the aroma of freshly baked bread, Stephanie closed her eyes and whispered to the sky that it had all been worth it, that her mother was right. The heart that gives never dies, because its love lives on in every life we touch. And so, Mother Ruth's earthly journey came to an end, but her legacy was just beginning. From a forgotten dump, her love blossomed, saving one life, Walter, and ultimately saving the lost soul of her own daughter, Stephanie. This story reminds us of a simple truth. Forgiveness is not an act, it is a state of the soul. It is the only power that can heal the deepest wounds. Throughout this story, what moment truly touched your heart? What did you learn from Mother Ruth's compassion, Walter's gratitude, or Stephanie's journey of redemption? I truly want to read your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. If this story has warmed your soul, don't hesitate to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Our channel has many more meaningful and profound stories waiting for you to discover. Thank you for listening with all your heart. Remember, even in the darkest night, a single act of kindness can light up a star.